We are now pros at making selections from our last video. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in and start selecting this astronaut. What I want to do is I want to cut out this astronaut and I'm going to place him in this landscape. I'm going to start by using the quick select tool to make just some quick selections. Oh, I have the wrong layer selected. This is an easy mistake to make, so I will not edit this part out. I need to have selected the spaceman layer and I was on the landscape layer. So I'm going to switch the spaceman layer and then start my selection. So I'm just using the quick select tool. This will partially be a little demo on how to use these tools again. Just to very quickly select this. Okay, now this is good enough to work with. I'm going to switch to my lasso tool now. I'm going to use my lasso tool and really zoom in on this image. And I'm holding down Shift to add to my selection, and I'm just going to do it kind of chunk by chunk. I'm just going to follow this line. I'm just holding down Alt Option to remove some of these extra little bits here. Looks good enough to me to at least start with. Oh, here's a spot. Holding down Shift, I'm going to add all this. Okay, so I have this selection generally around my figure, my astronaut, and I'm going to go to the top and click Select and Mask. Now this is present on any of these selection tools, Select and Mask. Whenever I do that, yours might look a little bit different than mine, but we're going to be in the Select and Mask Properties view. First, there's a transparency slider. I'm going to move that all the way up to 100%. This is my recommendation. Just put it at 100% right away. It's going to give us a preview of what this is going to look like whenever we cut it out. Now, there's definitely some problems with it. We can clean those up later. But I'm going to show you some ways to clean that up in here. Let's go to Global Refinements. So there's a smooth slider. Now especially watch the top of the astronaut's head. Here, I'll kind of move over there. See how whenever it's really high, it's really smooth. Whenever it's lower, it's a little bit more jagged. This is definitely like a less is more situation. I'm going to stick around. I'm definitely going to be under 20. I'm going to say like 19. So smooth just tries to smooth out the selection. So some of those jagged edges that we had down here, I'll put this back at 0. See these jagged edges? Those disappear whenever we change the smooth. Let's change feather. Feathering is a softness measurement. So what that does is it softens the edge. In this case, I want a pretty firm edge because I'm fine with this being a kind of stark contrast. So I want a firm edge, so I'm going to leave that at 0. But let's say I wanted a softer selection, I could just move that up. Again, a less is more situation. You definitely want to stay under, I would say, 2 pixels. Now contrast is kind of the opposite of feather. So whenever I do contrast, the edges are going to become more defined. So whereas feather, just to show you that again, feathers out those edges, contrast will enhance the edge. So I'm going to up that to about 20%. And then there's the Shift Edge option. Shift Edge, whenever I move it up, it's going to expand my selection. Whenever I move it down, it's going to shrink my selection. This is so helpful whenever we've made selections like this. In my case, I need to shrink my selection. Notice he has some background right here. There's some background right here. So I'm going to shrink that selection by moving it down. I'm going to move it to about 30%. Okay. So we've refined our selection now. And again, we can come back and edit this later because there are still some problems. But at this point, I can go to the final option, which is Output Settings. Output settings is going to ask me decontaminate colors. I'll say no, I'll just leave that how it is. It says output to, and I can either say selection, layer mask, or a bunch of other options. I'm going to say layer mask. So remember, I told you layer masking is a non-destructive way of cutting out things. It's basically how we modify the opacity, so the transparency or the clarity of a layer. So in this case, with a layer mask, I'm going to be masking all the areas around my astronaut. I'm going to click OK. And voila, my astronaut is good to go. I can move him around. I have a nice little cutout astronaut. Now let's actually look at what happened here. On the right-hand side, I have my spaceman landscape and background layer. In my spaceman layer, I have this icon, which looks very similar to the landscape icon, and it is. It's the same. And I also have this icon, this black and white icon. And then between them I have a link, a little chain link. I'm going to go ahead and show you this before I tell you how to actually access this view. So a layer mask, like I said, is a non-destructive way of cutting things out. Basically, this is what's called an alpha channel. This is a visual way of modifying the transparency or opacity of a layer. What this is actually saying, the viewer will never see this layer mask. What this is saying is this is talking to the computer, and it's telling the computer, hide whatever is painted black, show whatever is painted white. So in our case, it's hiding the background, and it's showing the astronaut that we had selected before. So just to go back to that, black hides, white reveals. So just to show you a little bit closer, I'm going to use a brush tool, and I'm just going to paint a white line. Notice that that white line has revealed that area that previously was hidden because it was painted black. Again, I'll show you how to get to this a little bit later. So if I paint over this, I go back, it's disappeared. So a layer mask is basically a very efficient and kind of complex way of hiding elements of your image, changing the transparency of it dynamically. Layer masks are one of the most widely used parts of Photoshop, and really one of the reasons that Photoshop became such a successful program. So let's talk about how we actually access the layer mask. So by default, these are linked together, so I can move them around, move my layer around, and it's going to look the same. I can select, notice that the little white brackets change based on what I have selected, and also up here this changes, it says layer mask whenever I have the layer mask selected, and it says RGB spaceman whenever I have the spaceman selected. So if I select the layer mask, to actually see it, I hold down Alt or Option on Mac and click. That will visually show me the layer mask. To exit this view, I can just do the same click, or I can click back on my original image. So I'm holding down Alt or Option, and I click, and I'm viewing the layer mask. And I'm seeing some of the problem areas, actually. It's very common to view your layer mask and see where there might have been an issue. So for instance, this little jutting out of the knee, there's this kind of weird error here. If we go back to our image, okay, yeah, I see that. I see there's like a little part that's kind of sticking out. This is a little wiggly. So it's very common to evaluate the quality of your mask after you've created it. Now to actually modify that mask, we can use the brush tools. There's a variety of other ways to kind of play with this. Just to show you, if I select it by holding down Alt or Option, and then I'm going to get my brush tool, which is B on the keyboard. I can change my brush settings up here. We haven't gone over brushes yet, we will later. And if I zoom in, I can actually very easily paint away some of these problem areas. Yeah, that fixed it. So the other way of editing this mask, so that technique I was holding down Alt or Option, clicking, and then manually painting on it. The other way of doing that is simply double-clicking the mask. Whenever you double-click it, you might get a pop-up on your screen that says, what do you want to do? Go ahead and say, enter select and mask. Select and mask is this interface we were using. And we can come back in here and still edit these settings. So I can come back in here and enhance the contrast. I can smooth out the edges more. I can shift the edge in a little bit more, out a little bit more. So notice this is all non-destructive. I can come in here and edit this. I just want to make sure my output to layer mask is selected down here. I hit OK, and we're good to go. I can still transform this, so I did Command T. I can still make any modification to it, and at any time, if there's ever a problem, I can right-click this mask and disable it, enable it, or I can even right-click it and delete it. Get rid of the mask altogether and start back at where we were. I'm going to undo that. So that covers the very basics of layer masks, and we're going to be using layer masks a lot in this class, so you'll get used to using that interface. But I just want to quickly take you through the process one final time by deleting that layer mask. Now we make a layer mask by first starting by making a selection. So I'm going to make a selection. I'm going to do a very quick one this time. Okay. I click Select and Mask up at the top. There's lots of settings to adjust in here that you can play with. Once I get something that I like, I make sure this output to is set to layer mask, and I say OK. And I've made a layer mask.